Lady Godiva was super popular during the Victorian era. The public just couldn't get enough of her. And Peeping Tom was really popular in the writing of the time, but not so much in the paintings. And that's because it's the viewer of those paintings who plays the part of Peeping Tom. The artist is Peeping Tom. You are Peeping Tom. Let me tell you a little bit more about Lady Godiva during the Victorian era. In my last video, I told you all about Lady Godiva, how she was a real person in the 11th century, but then in the 13th century, they started this legend about her where she was riding naked on horseback in order to save her people of taxes. And then at some point, Peeping Tom gets added to this legend, and he's supposed to be respecting her privacy, but he watches her. And so he comes to a terrible end where he either dies or his eyes fall out of his head. That legend has endured up until this very day, but it is never more popular than it was during the Victorian period. So in today's Detangler, I'm going to tell you about Victorian Godiva. This is the Detangler where I talk about hair, because I love hair. I don't really think so much about how we style it or how we take care of it, but I'm fascinated by these stories that we tell about hair, how hair shows up in our culture, and the kinds of reactions that we people have to hair. So thank you for joining me on the Detangler. Let's talk about Victorian Godiva. Lady Godiva was really popular during the Victorian period, so that was the 63 and a half or so years of Queen Victoria on the throne, and her popularity didn't just come out of nowhere. There were a few reasons that led up to it. There were these annual processions happening in Coventry. They started in the 17th century, and somebody would play Godiva. It started where it was a boy, and it eventually became a woman. She wasn't actually naked. She was wearing like a nude suit. Sometimes she had really great equestrian skills. By the time we get to the beginning of the 19th century, this annual procession is a big deal. It's like a tourist attraction. And every year they put out pamphlets about the Godiva procession, and these are kind of popular. People are reading them. So it's fairly common knowledge to know the story of Lady Godiva and Peeping Tom. People loved him because he was so naughty, and they could kind of project their own lascivious desires onto him. Another reason why Lady Godiva became really popular in the Victorian time is because long hair was in. For a long time, women were wearing wigs, remember? Like, we're talking 18th century. Now, those were those big old powdered wigs, but that kind of came to an end at the end of the 18th century because we had the French Revolution, off with her head, and people really didn't want to be wearing those big old elaborate fancy I am aristocracy wigs. Actually, for a while, it was popular to cut your hair short, a la victime or guillotine style, in solidarity with the aristocracy who got beheaded in France with the French Revolution. So anyway, women's hair was short for a while there. It was a style. It wasn't like everyone had their hair short. That's why in Bridgerton, the Queen is still wearing a wig, and the aristocracy, they're all still wearing wigs. And that's the early 19th century before Queen Victoria rises. So there are still wigs happening. But by the time Victoria comes to the throne, long hair is the style. But you wouldn't really get to see it. I mean, you would on girls. It was okay to wear your hair down up until you were aged like 15 or 16 or so. And at that point, you were expected to wear your hair in an updo whenever you'd be in public. So the only time you would ever see a woman with long hair in Victorian times was in the privacy of your own home. It was a very intimate thing. For example, look at this lovely lady whose bun is half undone and her hair is flowing over her naked shoulders. So thirsty. Well, that is none other than Queen Victoria herself, who commissioned this portrait for her husband, Prince Albert, for his 24th birthday. It's known as the secret picture, and it was only ever meant for his eyes. Queen Victoria referred to it as my darling Albert's favorite picture. That's why whenever you see a woman with long hair in Victorian photos, it's a bit titillating. Actors, singers, and performers, they would show their hair, like the Sutherland sisters who toured with the circus, or the opera singer Mary Garden, or maybe they were women of low status, or maybe they wouldn't show their face, or they might even be appearing in their underwear, which was basically porn of the day. These are meant to be provocative, but that wasn't how women in polite society would appear. Godiva gave artists a pretext to revel in this sensuous, private subject under the guise of high art. A third factor that brought about Lady Godiva's popularity during the Victorian times were the Pre-Raphaelites. Victorian British art is dominated by the Pre-Raphaelites, who reveled in sumptuous beauty and rebelled against academic British painting. Up until then, British painting was mainly all about landscapes and portraits, partially because that's what clients wanted, and partially because the Royal Academy, which ruled the British art scene at the time, was a bit stifling. So yeah, nudes were Italian or French or Dutch or ancient Roman art, but not so much British art. And those nudes were almost always depicting biblical or mythological scenes. But starting in the Victorian era, the artists started testing the boundaries of the Royal Academy, and they're like, we can do nudes too, and British history is just as important as ancient Rome. So with the new seriousness of English history and this new genre of the female nude, you've kind of set the stage for Lady Godiva. And with long hair being really popular, and with more awareness of the story of Lady Godiva, it almost seems inevitable that Lady Godiva became really popular during the Victorian time. But the tipping point really started just after Queen Victoria ascended the throne, and Alfred Lord Tennyson came out with a poem about Lady Godiva in 1842. This starts the Godiva craze in full force. You start getting artists who are specifically referencing Tennyson's poem. Things like the dogs that never had appeared in the Godiva tale before suddenly now make an appearance in a lot of the paintings. Also Leofric having long hair, that's directly from Tennyson's poem. Art historian Anna Jameson sort of traces this growing popularity of Lady Godiva in art. She explains how Godiva went from being a nobody to a serious subject in art. She describes how in the 1820s, her artist friends laughed at her when she suggested Lady Godiva as a subject for their art. And then in the 1840s, she says that they wouldn't laugh at her anymore. She says, "If I were to propose Lady Godiva as a subject now, I believe it would be received with a far different feeling even by those very men." And then in the 1850s, she comments how at that very moment, Godiva was in the Royal Academy, inspired by Tennyson's poem. She was talking about this sculpture, and probably the bit of Tennyson's poem that inspired this is where he says, "She lingered, looking like a summer moon half dipped in cloud. Anon she shook her head and showered the rippled ringlets to her knee." Anna Jameson liked Godiva so much, she said, "If I were Queen of England, I would have it painted in fresco in my council chamber." And indeed, the Queen of England, Victoria herself, did love Lady Godiva. She gave this one as a birthday present to Prince Albert in 1857. Again, this was probably influenced by Tennyson's poem, where he describes her horse or palfrey as emblazoned with armorial gold. Queen Victoria's favorite painter, Landseer, painted Godiva. Queen Victoria saw it in his studio, and that was why he added the ermine fur to make it more royal. The model in this painting is Eliza Crowe, whose stage name was Madame Wharton, and she played Godiva in the 1848 Godiva procession in Coventry, but she was also famous for being a nude model. So she would create these tableaux vivants, which is like a living painting. You get a bunch of people all to pose and look like some famous painting. So Eliza Crowe was known as Madame Wharton, but Madame Wharton was also known to be other people. So I think she was like the Dread Pirate Roberts, where they would pass along the name of Madame Wharton. That's whoever was running this show of the tableaux vivants. So this painting is really gentle compared to a lot of the other Lady Godiva painting. In the poem, they do describe the dogs as this curs, but that's not a cur, that's a cute little lapdog on a tuffet. And what the heck are those pigeons doing there? I really like the maid in the background, whose eyes are closed to respect the modesty of Lady Godiva. And here, Lady Godiva is doing a prayer before she goes out to do her ride. I just think it's interesting that the model for that painting is somebody whose job is rather unseemly. She's a nude model. She's, one step up from a prostitute as far as Victorian class structure goes, which is oh so important. So the real person is this lowly character, but is being admired by Queen Victoria. Lady Godiva is kind of the bridge between the two. She's famous for her beautiful flesh, but she's trying to do this very respectable, important, self-sacrificing act of generosity. And I think Queen Victoria really relates to that, or wants to. She wants people to see her as a generous, benevolent, for the people leader. Ultimately, one of the appeals of Godiva was her comparison to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria liked to see herself as a champion for the people, but she was the kind of woman who was always corseted and would never let her hair down. Toward the end of the Victorian era, we get Collier's Godiva. This is probably the most famous of all of the Godiva paintings. And she looks beautiful, of course, but she also looks really young, doesn't she? Really passive, kind of dejected. In studies for this painting, she's facing the viewer, but her eyes are still downcast. She's still passively allowing the gaze. The model for this is Mabel, or Mabe Paul. She was an actress in the West End, and like with Madame Morton in the Landseer painting, we have here a real woman who's in a low-status profession playing someone who's high status, but who's debasing herself out of generosity for her people. And then that image is consumed and appreciated by high-status people. In June 1898, this Godiva was exhibited at the New Gallery in London, where it was deemed the picture of the exhibition. Mabe Paul was only 16 at the time of this painting, right at that borderline age when a Victorian girl should start wearing her hair up. Godiva was an opportunity for these artists and viewers to lecherously gaze at the body of this young girl, while ostensibly telling a story about piety and modesty and generosity. And I think we find it okay to do this because in the end, Godiva isn't debased. She comes out with her dignity intact. She's not humiliated. She's triumphant. If you've ever read Laura Mulvey, then you know about the male gaze, the pleasure of looking at the female body. This has a long history, and we need to look critically at these images. What we see is that we are the ones gazing. We are the peeping toms in this situation. Seeing women with their hair down in their most private moments is allowed through the prestige of painting. So the artistic nude is a way of dancing right on that border between respectable and obscene. Some people knew this. George Watts was the woke male artist of his day. He recognized that a lot of painters were using Lady Godiva as an excuse to just lecherously leer at a nude woman. He painted this version of Lady Godiva after she returns from her ride as a protest against that kind of exploitation. Here, you can see that her nudity is not the point, but the beauty of her sacrifice and the love felt for her by the people who she helped. This is a study for the painting. Watts painted her for her heroism, not for Peeping Tom. Here's George Watts's painting of his friend, the famous Victorian feminist Josephine Butler. She was a prolific writer, a devout Christian, and incredibly empathetic toward women in prostitution. Suffragist Millicent Fawcett called her the most distinguished Englishwoman of the 19th century. There's a book about her called The Patron Saint of Prostitutes. One of her big issues was the abolition of child prostitution and sex trafficking. In 1883, she published a pamphlet called The New Godiva, where she said the existing social code was rotten. She compares young girls forced into prostitution to a new Godiva, and she says that from them, a harder thing than the mere laying down of one's life has been required. From her, too, it has been exacted to place upon the altar her reputation, exposing herself to something worse than mere physical torture. For Butler, Godiva was a woman of courage, whose self-exposure challenged sexual assumption and could change minds. Her essay helped to shift the crime of prostitution off of these young girls and onto the men who exploited them. That's what Godiva stood for. She was a heroic champion whose very vulnerability was her strength. And she was also a sexy piece of eye candy. She lets the viewer play Peeping Tom while also moralizing about Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom is the moral of a story, but also the guilty protagonist of the story. Obviously, the legend of Lady Godiva has gone beyond the Victorian era and lasts right until this very day. So what do you think? Which Godiva is your favorite? Let me know. I want to hear your thoughts about Lady Godiva, whatever questions or comments you might have, and your questions about other stories of hair in history or things that you've observed about hair, questions you have about hair. Thank you so much for watching The Detangler and listening to my story. Here's to you.